Dare you defy me, even though you're just a daughter-in-law?
As my father-in-law's angry voice echoed, something cold was poured over my head. It took me a moment to realize that it was wine.
Really, such a useless daughter-in-law. I wish you would just leave.
Far from calming her husband, my mother-in-law sneered instead. And then a shocking truth was revealed to me. My name is Jessica. I am a 35-year-old company employee, and my tall stature is a complex for a woman. Additionally, I have a high educational background which allowed me to secure a job at a major foreign company, hence, I have a substantial income. I think to myself that, were I a man, I could boast about these high specs. In fact, my husband Ben often remarks,
"You were born the wrong gender, huh?"
Ben often insists that I have pulled the role of the main provider, probably because I damage his pride as a man. Having a high income is not a fault, rather it's something good. If my husband doesn't think well of me, then perhaps it is an unnecessary burden for a woman. Our living expenses are deposited into a bank account under Ben's name at his request. I deposit my salary into that account. We use the funds in that account for everyday shopping, and even the utility bills and credit card payments are under my husband's name. This arrangement seems to be his way of maintaining the appearance of being the main provider. However, the mortgage payments are under my name because of the large amount, just in case something happens. Well, that's a minor issue, and I don't think there's a particular problem with Ben regarding this. What concerns me more is my relationship with my in-laws. From the beginning of our marriage, I've had a difficulty relationship with them. When we first met, they mocked me for my height, saying I was not feminine. Moreover, when they learned that I graduated from a far better university than Ben, they were hesitant about the marriage itself.
"A woman with education is a haughty woman who doesn't know how to support her man."
It was completely biased, and I found it truly rude as an attitude to take at a first meeting. Eventually, Ben persuaded them, and while they stopped opposing the marriage, they still looked down on me. Still, since they are Ben's parents who raised him, I want to get along well and avoid causing trouble. However, there was another issue with my in-laws. They were exceedingly extravagant with money. They had long since spent their retirement funds, had no savings, and their pension was far from enough to cover their expenses. To top it off, when they were in the red, they asked Ben for money instead of refusing. Furthermore, instead of refusing, Ben suggested that he wanted to send them money every month. But Ben, you don't really have that much spare money, do you? I blurted out, and Ben frowned.
"That's true, but I think it's better than being asked for money from strange places."
There was some truth in that. If the financially irresponsible in-laws were tempted by users, they might demand far more money from us than just the remittances. So in the end, I ended up contributing the money. I deposited more money than usual into the account we always use for living expenses and transferred it from there to my in-laws' account. I don't mind contributing the money if it's an amount I can afford. However, I want those two to clearly understand that I am the one providing the money. I asked Ben this because I hoped it might lead to a more decent treatment of me by my in-laws. This time, Ben consulted me without shouldering it alone. In other words, setting aside his complexes and pride, he relied on me. Likewise, if my in-laws, who usually look down on me as a man-like, realize there's a benefit, they might reconsider and see me as a dependable person. After all, it's because of my high education and income that I can make the remittances. If they understood that, they wouldn't be able to complain about me being presumptuous or whatever anymore. Thus, I harbored hopes for our future relationship while also contributing to my in-laws' remittances. However, contrary to my expectations, their attitude remained unchanged.
It's so sad that Ben has to be with such an unpleasant education-bragging woman.
When I went to my in-laws' house, the snide comments continued as usual. I was spending as much as $3,000 every month for their living expenses, and they were completely dependent on me, yet I never heard a word of thanks from them. Usually they say I'm bragging about my education, but I only mentioned my education during my introduction. Other than that, I never brought up my education on my own.
No matter which university you graduated from, it's useless once you're in society. That's all you have to boast about, isn't it?
Such comments are indeed irritating. As far as I'm concerned, my educational background is the result of my efforts during my student days. It's not true that it's useless in society. I got my current job by utilizing what I learned at school. I tried to respond modestly, despite the buildup of frustrations I had. And because of that, my income is stable, so Ben doesn't have to bear the burden. And about the remittance. However, while I was speaking, my father-in-law interrupted me grumpily.
Instead of being grateful to your husband, you have to make everything about your doing. That's why I dislike mannish women.
Facing such attitudes, I realized that saying more could lead to a serious argument. Thinking this, I closed my mouth, and Ben seemed concerned as well. When we got home, he immediately apologized for his parents' behavior.
As promised, the remittance is coming from your money, and I've explained that to them.
Ben looked apologetic, and I returned a wry smile. It's not your fault, so don't worry. To my in-laws, even the fact that the wife was making the remittance might seem presumptuous. Surely they must understand that they are benefiting from this. But feelings are feelings, I suppose. Maybe emotions just can't be changed. Thinking that we might never understand each other for the rest of our lives, I felt a little sad. Within 6 months, I was summoned to my in-laws' house for a family gathering. Ben's family is large, and preparing meals for such gatherings is always a struggle. Yet cleaning the entire house and cooking massive amounts of food always falls to me.
Hurry up and work. Don't think you, a daughter-in-law, get to rest.
Without wringing a rag or washing a potato, my mother-in-law just sat there giving me orders. It's always like this when relatives gather, but this time I had been working overtime until the day before. By the time the relatives gathered, I was completely exhausted. While eating dinner, I was thinking about finally sitting down, but I couldn't relax for even 10 minutes.
Hey, you, come here and pour the drinks.
I was called over by my father-in-law before I had even finished eating half of my meal. His face was red, clearly drunk already. My father-in-law, who hadn't helped prepare for the banquet at all, was just eating and drinking as he pleased. Unlike the carefree father-in-law, I was exhausted from working nonstop and really just wanted to lie down right then. Moreover, I hadn't had a proper lunch, so I was at my limit. That's why I responded with both my body and spirit utterly drained. Please, wait a moment. I've just started eating. Can you wait until I've finished my plate? In the next moment, my father-in-law's angry voice boomed.
How dare you defy me, just a daughter-in-law?
I heard his rough footsteps approaching, but I didn't have the luxury of looking up for my meal. Since I was already being assigned tasks while eating, I hurried to finish my meal, preparing to be yelled at from close range by my father-in-law. However, before I could even look back to see what was wrong, something cold was suddenly poured over my head. What? For a moment, I was stunned, but then I quickly noticed the wine bottle in my father-in-law's hand. And from the liquid dripping down from my hair, I recognized the distinctive smell. It was definitely wine that had been poured over me. I was astounded by this unexpected turn of events, and then I heard my mother-in-law's sneering voice.
Ah, what a fitting sight for a useless daughter-in-law.
Instead of reprimanding her husband, my mother-in-law seemed rather pleased and continued.
Oh, what's with that look? I've heard that wine contains good ingredients for the hair. Maybe this will boost your feminine charm a bit.
It seemed she no longer bothered to hide her disdainful attitude towards me, even in front of the relatives.
It's because you never obey your husband's parents, even though you married into our family. You brought this on yourself. Clean this up.
After saying this, my father-in-law left the empty bottle by my side and returned to his seat.
Really, what a useless daughter-in-law. I wish you would just leave.
At that moment, something snapped inside me. As the wine cooled my hair and shoulders, my insides boiled with rage. You always say I'm useless, but then please stop depending on me for living expenses. Determined to say everything on my mind today, no matter how hostile the atmosphere, I glared at my in-laws. However, they just laughed off what I was saying.
When have we ever relied on someone like you? Ben helps us out with a monthly allowance of $3,000. You don't do anything, do you?
Hearing this, I was momentarily speechless, unable to grasp the meaning of their words.
That's right. You have nothing to offer but your education. Just a useless wife leeching off her husband. Don't take credit for what your husband does.
It took me a few seconds to realize they didn't know who was actually providing the money. Ben, what do you mean? I thought you explained that the money for the allowance comes from me. I turned to my husband, who was sitting silently next to me, and he awkwardly looked away. That's when I finally understood. Ben had lied. He hadn't told his parents that the money was coming from me. It was natural that their attitude was still bad. Ben had been claiming the allowance as his own achievement. As I looked down, drops fell from my wet hair. Though Ben had some pride, I hadn't expected him to lie. He knew how his parents were treating me. Ignoring the reason I had asked him to tell his parents, how could he not have imagined this? If Ben had properly conveyed this, I wouldn't have suffered like this today. Realizing that the husband I trusted had actually betrayed me, I was too shocked to look up. My in-laws continued to berate me as usual. The relatives were perplexed, but those two didn't care about anyone's gaze anymore. As I listened to the barrage of insults with my head down, questions began to arise. Why did I have to put up with all this chaos? Had Ben ever really stood up for me before? Why was it always me? As these thoughts circled in my mind, the words just came out. Then I'll stop the allowance and leave. Those words resonated deeply within me. Yes, I'll leave. There's no reason to deal with these people anymore. Feeling strangely liberated, I left my in-laws' house, ignoring the shocked expressions of my in-laws. The call from Ben came the next day. I had left my in-laws' house with only my essentials and important belongings from our home. I also left the divorce papers. Ben must have been surprised when he came home and found them.
Where are you? You don't even have a home to return to.
I don't have parents to go back to, so going back home isn't an option for me. That's why Ben never imagined that I could actually leave. Me? I'm at an internet cafe right now, gathering real estate information. Ben raised his voice in response.
For what purpose?
Well, you saw the divorce papers I left, didn't you? If we're getting a divorce, I need to find a new place to live. My matter-of-fact tone seemed to shock Ben, and he fell silent for a while. Finally, he spoke in a strained voice.
I want to talk in person.
Accepting Ben's request, I paused my search and decided to return home for a while. When I arrived, Ben was waiting with a stern look on his face.
Are you serious about getting a divorce?
I nodded silently, and Ben looked displeased.
It wasn't me who threw the drink on you.
You think that was the only issue? Have you ever acted appropriately towards me during our entire marriage? Despite being my husband, Ben had never protected me from his parents. If a spouse sees their parents mistreating their partner, they would usually defend them or intervene. But you didn't, did you? Throughout our marriage, Ben had me contribute financially while resenting that I earned more. Now I understand. I felt unnecessary for having a high income because my own husband devalued me. Moreover, you squandered every chance to improve our situation for the sake of your own pride. You acted as if what happened to me didn't concern you, right? If he had handled things properly, I wouldn't have had to struggle unnecessarily. If he hadn't lied about the money, his parents might not have treated me so badly. Even the incident with the wine yesterday was ultimately because of Ben.
But that's not a big deal. You know the term support from behind? Traditionally, it's the woman's role to keep the home, but since you earned, you should support me with your financial power.
However, Ben pursed his lips and continued to complain. I wouldn't mind taking on more of the household expenses or even the allowances if you had treated me fairly, but that's not the case. I glared at Ben sharply. I supported us in the ways I could, but you disregarded that and continually worsened my situation. That's why I've had enough. Ben still wore a dissatisfied expression, as if unwilling to admit any wrongdoing, resembling a child scolded for mischief. Remember how you always said, stand by your husband? Does that mean I should stay silent even when you take credit for my contributions? The issue of the allowance was indeed a case of Ben taking credit. I confronted him about this, and Ben, perhaps feeling cornered, suddenly shouted.
Enough. Fine, I get it. It's all my fault, you say. If that's what you want, I'll give you your divorce.
With that, he grabbed the untouched divorce papers, slammed them down on his desk, and hastily signed them.
There, happy now?
He smirked as he pushed the signed papers towards me.
I'd love to see how long you can survive on your own. You who have nothing but your education and rely on me for everything.
For a moment, I was stunned by Ben's mocking words. I don't recall relying on you that much. We split the household chores fairly, and I contribute more to our expenses. Ben frowned and retorted.
What? You're talking nonsense. All the living expenses come out of my account. Despite your earnings, you're stingy. You could have just silently given up the money for my parents' allowance.
It seemed he was under some misunderstanding, likely because all the withdrawals were set up through his account. He had apparently forgotten who was actually making the deposits. If left alone about the allowances, Ben might have eventually started to believe his own lies about his parents' situation as the truth. Well, it doesn't matter. Once I stop depositing, you'll see the reality soon enough. Here, take this. I handed him the papers I had printed at the internet cafe. Ben didn't take them.
What's this? If you want to leave so badly, go ahead. Where you live after this has nothing to do with me.
Ben glanced briefly at the papers, noting they were all for small one-room apartments, and smirked condescendingly.
After all your talk, it's pathetic you can only afford such a small place.
But again, Ben was mistaken. These aren't for me, they're potential places for you to live, because this house is in my name. Did you forget that? I'm the one paying the mortgage? Ben froze, seemingly having truly forgotten. Did he finally understand that it was he who should leave if we divorced? I can't say I've gathered enough information just from yesterday, but it should help you get started. Frankly, I shouldn't have had to do this research, but I went to the internet cafe and prepared the documents, hoping he'd find a new place quickly. All these properties are not too far from your workplace, and they're affordable on your salary. My mention of income seemed to irritate Ben further.
Don't joke with me.
In the past, I might have rushed to appease him, but I now realized that was a waste of effort. After all, the truth about his lower income needed to be acknowledged for us to move forward. It's because I've always been too considerate that this has happened. Before we were married, I thought he was a bit unreliable but a kind person, and I didn't care about his income, so we got married. If he had just accepted the facts as they are and acted appropriately, things wouldn't have come to this. You know, I think you understand this, but from now on there will be no more allowances, so we have to make your father and mother financially independent, okay? I thought I was just stating the obvious, but Ben immediately turned red and burst out in anger when he heard it.
My parents live on their pension. Are you telling me to abandon my elderly parents?
Faced with Ben's outcry, I sighed. That's what pensions are for, to live within their means. It's ridiculous to ask for allowances just to live luxuriously.
But...
Ben tried to argue but couldn't find the right words. It's unlikely that those two, already accustomed to a luxurious lifestyle, could adapt to a frugal life now. But it's okay. If things go well, your father can manage to live behind the bars. Then the only person who will need living expenses is your mother. We can manage that for one person.
What? What do you mean?
Surprised by Ben, I urged him. Remember what your father did to me yesterday? Seeing that he still didn't understand, I reluctantly explained. You see it often in comics and dramas, like throwing water or coffee at someone, but legally that can also be considered assault. In other words, my father-in-law could be prosecuted for throwing wine on me. Actually, before I came home yesterday, I had already consulted with the police. The officer was kind and sympathetic as he saw me soaking wet and smelling of alcohol from my hair and clothes, but honestly, I am still anxious. It's clear I was victimized, but there's no physical evidence that my father-in-law did it. All the witnesses are relatives, and if any of them protect my father-in-law, there might not be enough evidence for prosecution. But I didn't plan to tell Ben that.
Are you really trying to put your own parent-in-law, even if by marriage, behind bars? You heartless, ungrateful person.
Even as he yelled, I felt nothing. Who's the ungrateful one? You can't live without my allowances. Well, you probably didn't know that because of your actions, but that's just unacceptable. I had done most of the work preparing for yesterday's banquet. Even that alone should have earned me some gratitude from my in-laws, but they took it for granted. That treatment was indeed the epitome of ungrateful. But Ben still had a sulky expression as I delivered the final blow. You seem to forget, but the relatives were watching then, weren't they? If they are decent, they'll tell you how terribly your parents treated me. It seems neither my in-laws nor Ben was aware of the others watching them during the incident. By confronting him with this reality, Ben finally seemed to understand that his family would be isolated if things continued this way.
No joke. If you leave under these circumstances, my parents and I will be blamed by all our relatives.
Yes. I nodded, seeing Ben's pale face. If we divorced after what had happened, it would be clear where the fault lay without needing to explain.
Yes. If you come back, everything will be resolved. It was just a little prank.
I grimaced deeply at that. Why should I cover for you? It's your own doing. Clean up your own mess. But Ben's reluctance to give up was the only admirable thing about him.
No, I really don't want a divorce. I love you.
Ignoring him, I carefully placed the already filled out divorce papers in my bag. Just leave quickly. With that, I hurried off to the municipal office. Later, my father-in-law was arrested for throwing the drink on me. No one protected him, and solid testimonies were given, partly because someone had recorded the incident on their mobile phone. As a result, my father-in-law now faced a strict trial and criminal charges. Having lost the allowance, my mother-in-law struggled financially and turned to Ben for help, but he couldn't manage without my support. No one in the family was willing to help, knowing the situation. The arguments between my resentful mother-in-law and the verbally abusive Ben continued daily. As for me, I was free from the troubles of the past and could focus on my work with a brighter outlook. Thanks to this, my performance at work improved, and there were talks of a promotion. Being competent at work is not a shortcoming as a woman. It's one of my strengths. From now on, I've decided to live as myself, without associating with those who belittle me.